Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Alex. I'm with the Scholar, and as always, I am live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at the bookstore. Thank you for tuning in this evening as we welcome Joshua Ferris and Rebecca Makkai to virtual Harrisburg. To our viewers out there, thank you for supporting our authors. Thank you for supporting indie bookstores, and we hope you enjoy this evening's program. But at this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers here this evening to you. Our interviewer this evening is Rebecca Makkai. Rebecca's latest novel, The Great Believers, was a finalist for both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. It was the winner of the ALA Carnegie Medal, the Stonewall Book Award, the LA Times Book Prize, the Clark Fiction Prize, the Midwest Independent Booksellers Award, and the Chicago Review of Books Award. And it was one of the New York Times 10 Best Books of 2018. Her other books are the novels The Borrower and The 100-Year House, and the collection Music for Wartime, 4 stories from which appeared in the Best American Short Stories. Rebecca is on the MFA faculties of Sierra Nevada College and Northwestern University, and she is the artistic director of Story Studio Chicago. Visit her at RebeccaMakkai.com or on Twitter at Rebecca Makkai. Of course, our featured author this evening is Joshua Ferris. Joshua is the author of 3 previous novels, Then We Came to the End, The Unnamed, and To Rise Again at a Decent Hour, and a collection of short stories, The Dinner Party. He was a finalist for the National Book Award, winner of the Barnes & Noble Discovery Award and the Penn Hemingway Award, and was named one of the New Yorker's 20 under 40 writers in 2010. To Rise Again at a Decent Hour won the Dylan Thomas Prize and was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. His short stories have appeared in the New Yorker, Granta, and Best American Short Stories, and he lives in New York. Of course, Joshua's new book that we are here for this evening is titled A Calling for Charlie Barnes. Here it is. One blurb, I get one blurb. This one's from Garth Risk Hallberg, who writes, quote, "Funny, moving, and formally a work of genius, A Calling for Charlie Barnes is quite literally the book Joshua Ferris was born to write." Now, some quick housekeeping before we get started. If you have a question for Joshua or Rebecca, please use the Q&A button. It's towards the bottom of the screen below our faces here. Click on that. We'd love to hear from you. So ask away at any point. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible towards the end of the program. And lastly, most importantly, if you're interested in purchasing a signed copy of A Calling for Charlie Barnes, we'd love for you to consider purchasing it through your host bookstore this evening, the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. That is the #1 way to support this event series and programming. We have exclusive signed copies available, like I mentioned. So look in the chat room in just a moment. I'll provide a link there for you, or simply head to midtownscholar.com. Again, signed copies available while supplies last. But now, without further ado, Joshua Ferris and Rebecca Makkai.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. I'm so
Rebecca,
excited.
thank you so much for doing this.
You're welcome. I was really excited to.
You're the best.
Yeah, I've had a blast. Like I'm between books right now, just kind of, working on stuff.
Yeah.
And I've had a blast doing these things on Zoom that, I love doing them when people actually come to Chicago and I can be in the bookstore and sit there and do the cup of barefoot Chardonnay and the pretzel sticks thing. But
COVID won't hold you down.
I know, right? It's really fun to be, it's like you're in New York. I'm appropriately for this book in the Chicago suburbs.
Awesome.
And then we're virtually in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and who knows where people are. It's a silver lining, right?
Yeah, it is. It's a little strange, but I have also, jumped in and participated in things like this and things that I would not have participated in because I'm out in the boondocks in upstate New York. I mean, I can't get into the city or,
Oh, you're like, okay, I didn't know. Yeah, you're
I'm outside.
Yeah.
And there I am, like, participating in the event of the year, it feels like, or whatever. And it is a real silver lining. I mean, it's mediated. It's a little less than ideal, but when you can do this, it's terrific.
Yeah. It's something, I think it's something we're going to keep doing too. Like I can't imagine that people won't have a few online.
Yeah. Well, one thing is that it's very cheap,
It is indeed.
There's a low barrier to entry.
Everyone buys their own cup of barefoot Chardonnay, and
exactly. We can all afford
it. So I finished this book today, which I started it way back just out of excitement, and then life intervened, and so I was like, I'm going to set aside. I'm going to finish this book today, and it's I'm completely bowled over. It's something my dad passed away last year, kind of pre-COVID. So, and very difficult person, very interesting, charismatic, sort of narcissistic person. So there was a lot that I was relating to in this book, and it was kind of helping me deal with some stuff. So I was in this sort of really emotional state. I actually finished it on audio, which I do a lot of my listening as I ride my bike. So I was finishing it today, riding this bike with Nick Offerman.
Yeah.
Incredible job.
Does he? I haven't heard it yet. I need to hear it.
He's great. I listen to most things on double speed, and he's definitely a double speeder. He got in there and went, oh, he's reading slow, which is it's great, you know, because like it's good that that's an option. Yeah. I think I had him on like 2.2 or 2.3 by the end.
You sped old Nick up. You got to get through this, Nick. I got an event to do.
It really was. This was early. I still had time to spare, but you know, it was like just to I talk fast, so I need to listen fast. Yeah. But I was kind of out there just in this forest preserve on my bike, letting the end of this book wash over me, and I was completely blown away, as I knew I would be.
Thank you.
I've been a fan of your work for a long time, but this feels really different from your other books in a lot of ways, and I want to talk about some of those. And so, you know, so the kind of super obvious question here that I think you're going to get asked in every single interview, although the book's only been out for 3 days, so I've only, you know, I got to be in the first dozen or so people to ask you this. This is definitely a novel that invites us to see it as autofiction, as autobiographical fiction, right? I am curious about, I think there are maybe sillier questions to ask, and you're welcome to answer on your own, just about like exactly what's real and what's not. But I'm less interested in that than in the decision to sort of, you know, to give us something that you're inviting us to see as potentially really autobiographical, but to create a lot of distance there with names that are clearly not the real name. The idea of this being fundamentally a fiction, and fiction is talked about a lot within the book. Yeah. Was that, I'm struggling to form this into a question. I should just put a giant question mark on everything I just said. But like, what process-wise, how did you arrive at that level of distance or level of closeness to real life?
It took a long time. I mean, my father died in 2014, and he is clearly sort of the representative, the avatar of this character, right? But I didn't just want to, or I really couldn't kind of just memorialize him. You know, he was a complicated man, not nearly as complicated as the character that I eventually created. But I did all this writing and writing with the freedom to do so without it becoming a book. You know, I only in retrospect did I realize that it was grief. I was grieving. This was how I grieved as a writer. Was just to sort of like sit down and try to put him back in scene, bring him back to life. It was a kind of year or two where I was doing something that I had never done before, which was just like auto writing in a way. You know, I was like Henry Darger or something. It wasn't amounting to anything, and it bordered on madness, and it was odd, but in retrospect, it just feels like grief. So it was really only after I stopped attempting to memorialize the man, which incidentally was not terribly compelling, really either for me, it certainly wouldn't have been terribly compelling for the reader, and started to invent the character, which, you know, necessarily had a lot of discrepancies between my dad and him, that I started to play again. Essentially, I stopped grieving and started playing again. And so that's when, you know, I could pull in. I mean, I'll give you one very superficial difference. My father was married 4 times. The character in this book is married 5 times. When I made that invention, I thought, why am I doing that? And it was because I was clearly fictionalizing. And so I thought, well, the 5th wife should be named something goofy because she's not real. I'm inventing her. This is all pure fiction. And so that sort of led to, these other impulses to play. But there was also something more serious going on, not only with respect to like how to represent real people in fiction, but also about the ways in which we create these fictions to sustain us and, give us a reason to wake up in the morning.
Well, you have a
And
lot
so
of
that was imbued in there eventually.
yeah. You have so much of that thematically, just with, the brothers' kind of religious text as a sustaining fiction. The fictions that go into many of his marriages.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say sustain them because they're not necessarily sustained.
they don't get sustained very long.
Yeah. But there's this sort of exploration throughout, I think, of what you have one character who is actively writing fiction and everyone else around him who is fundamentally a fictionalizer of some kind, which is, I have to say, like it's so risky to make a character a fiction writer. And you do it really, really well, but there's that thing of, someone picking up a book and being like, oh, the main character's a writer. Or like, but it's not, I think in so many cases, it ends up being, it's just an exercise in self-indulgence. And what you were doing here that made it work was you're actually thematically saying really interesting things about our need for fiction on whatever level. But I mean, it must have been a kind of did that feel like a risky move to make this person a novelist?
Hugely. And, quite frankly, I failed for a long time to like figure out the right way in. I'll give you an example, and that is that I very early on just called that main character, called the narrator by my name. So, that's a fairly typical way of going about writing autofiction. We've seen quite a lot of books that do that and appoint the narrator or the storyteller by their own name and introduce, some semblance of their real life into the fiction. Yeah. And I am convinced that my own take on my life is a fiction. I mean, it can't possibly understand its complexities. Right. It can't iron out its contradictions. It can't rid itself of its sustaining illusions. It can't really get a handle on this thing that I call Joshua Ferris. So I thought that was a valid tactic to call it Joshua Ferris. But at the same time, there's a sense in which if I did that, I would know this character. I would be this character. The writer and the narrator would be one. And I had to break that open. It's actually right when I realized that the character's name had to be Jake Barnes from The Sun Also Rises, that I realized that, I throw this bit of fictionality in, and there's no doubting that what I'm doing is writing a fiction, even as I'm claiming that it's truth. That was really important to bringing this book out of what I was calling earlier, kind of memorializing key or tone, and into a world that took itself less seriously, one, and actually was a book rather than just a series of like grief writings, or I don't know how to describe them, but that's what they were.
Well, and it actually is, I do usually expect humor from you, and not like light, fluffy, stuff, but I tend to find your writing very funny, particularly your dialogue. And it's everyone, so I teach the story, The Dinner Party, a lot to grad students or advanced students. And every single time I teach it, at some point they have to bear with me as I just read aloud the thing about sticking lamb chops up someone's ass. Like they have, every single time I'm like, just listen to this.
That's a great compliment. That's one of my best compliments ever.
I really like the lamb chops up the ass part. Yeah, it's a typical compliment, I know. So I go into your work not expecting it to be light, but expecting that humor. And I think it tends in this book to be very darkly situational. Rather, there are funny like exchanges. There are lines of dialogue. There are lines that are funny. We go, yes, I can recognize your writing there, but deep irony of, having called someone to tell them you have cancer and then you don't, but maybe you do. It actually is amusing. Amusing sounds like but there's something
Well,
human comedy kind of about it, right?
yeah, and I guess that what you mean really by situational is that it's a grim situation.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So you kind of can't avoid the fact that the comedy kind of undercuts it, but at the same time, it just makes it bearable. And I'll tell you where really that kind of came from. And that is, I didn't think about this when I was writing the book. As I say, I was doing all of this exploration. And actually, when I sat down to write the book, I just thought, well, if I am memorializing my father, it's not going to be funny. It can't be funny. I mean, it's about a man dying. And this man was very important to me. As I say, eventually I moved away from that. But I did remember something very, very kind of funny about the way in which he was diagnosed. He got a diagnosis on a Friday of pancreatic cancer. This is the real man. He got a diagnosis and he called me and he was utterly destroyed. He had this weird fear from a very early age of getting pancreatic cancer. Like it was really odd. And he had it and he knew what it meant and he knew he was dying and he was 68 and he was not prepared to die. And he was breaking down. He called his wife. This is how he knew. He called his wife after going in for initial procedure, got some numbers, and called his wife with these numbers because she's an oncologist. And she said, these are very bad numbers. See a specialist right away. So that's when he called me, broke down the neck. On Monday, after the weekend passed, he went and he saw this specialist. And in the meantime, these numbers, this write-up came in the mail, which I guess is a de facto thing that happens when you have these serious tests. His wife comes home, reads the numbers, and says, "You're fine." Oh. You gave me the wrong numbers. So calling her and giving the numbers verbally, he had screwed some number up.
Oh my God.
And she said, "You're fine. Chuck, you're fine." So he calls me, says, "Hey, I got good news. I don't have pancreatic cancer." 2 days later, those refined tests come in. He has pancreatic cancer.
Oh my God.
So he's twisted and turned, and he's gets a death sentence. He gets a reprieve. The death sentence returns, and that was funny, kind of. I mean, it wasn't funny at all because the man's life hung in the balance, but he could kind of laugh about that.
Yeah.
Certainly after, and I should say this is tangential to the book, but the real man had a surgery and lived for 7 more years. So he could sort of look back on that time, on the fear, on the uncertainty and all that, and reflect and laugh and do that sort of thing. So that kind of situation is do or die. It can be tragic and all that, but there is some weird thing that tends to slide in, some comedy that tends to find its way in to those situations if you're looking around, and if you might even need it because they are so grim. So when I landed on the fact that this was going to be a sort of about my father and it was going to be grim, I knew that I had to make sure. And he's a fuck up. He's largely not doing the right thing for those the first half of the book. That humor had to be there in order to mitigate some of the grimness.
Yeah. Well, speaking of humor, you were going to read, not to set people up for something like, wildly slapstick, but you were going to read to us, and you're going to read something that at least I find kind of funny. So would you be up for that?
I would be delighted to. So the character Charlie Barnes is a bit of an entrepreneur, an enterpriser. He has serial ideas that come to him in various ways. And here we're going to read about one idea that he had. Well, I think it says it in there, some like 1972 or something like that. Let us turn our attention to the Doolander. Premised on that ancient folk toy, the Gee-Haw Whammy Diddle, the Doolander's antecedents also included the Dayglow Dragonfly and the hand-powered whirligig. Here is how it came to be. Happy Necker, real name Julius, was manning the grill at Kickapoo State Park on a warm day in September, shortly after Nixon's second inauguration. Known for his good cheer and for co-owning the Cadillac dealership in town, Happy was one of Charlie's oldest pals and in his element behind a grill, a maestro with a spatula taking requests. The day was blue, the leaves just starting their death spiral into beauty. Happy's wife, a caseworker for public aid called Wyla, sat with Charlie's second wife, Barbara LaFirst, on a patchwork of picnic blankets, taking sips of that 70s special Riunite Lambrusco. At that time, men in America dressed up like Cubist paintings. Happy was wearing an atrocious combination of plaid and argyle, while Charlie, sporting a respectable beard, wore a light cardigan and smoked a briarwood pipe, the picture of a professor. But from the waist down, he was a pro baller as seen on TV with pale knees and tube socks. He had stepped in dog shit earlier that day and, as if in a bad dream, spent the rest of the afternoon dragging his foot across the grass, trying to rid himself of a haunting stench that might have been all in his own head. A stray dog sauntered onto that scene, the culprit, perhaps, of Charlie's misfortune. Something about its appearance among them gave Happy an idea. Spontaneous, witty, always seizing on the creative urge, Happy had a certain genius for what might be called the unlikely inevitable. Despite being in the company of friends, many of whom were completely in the dark about his male pattern baldness, Happy set down his spatula and peeled off his toupee while calling for the dog's attention. What happened next was between Happy and the dog, a lark, a light little gesture incidental to being shared. And yet, every picnicker seemed to turn at the moment Happy tossed his hairpiece as he might have a frisbee while exhorting the mutt to fetch. The toupee had no right to behave in the manner that it did. It had no aerodynamic lift. There was no wind. A lump of latex and fur, it deserved to drop in the heavy air like a wet rag. On the contrary, it soared. Like something piloted by John Glenn, it glided over acorns and buckeyes, past picnic tables and elm trees. The rapt audience, fortunate enough to catch this maiden flight, held its collective breath, eyes wide in every head, before all at once turning to one another and collapsing in tears of laughter, for the dog had caught it. Heeding Happy's command, the stray mutt leaped into action, launched itself with a twist, and came down with the toupee, which it tore into as if snapping the neck of a squirrel. It was also perfectly unlikely and utterly hilarious. Happy, standing erect and grinning wide, clapped both hands to his newly bald head and, turning to his friend, said the most remarkable thing Charlie had heard in all his time on earth. He said, "Looks like I'm a free man." Having lived in mortal fright of losing his hair since he and Charlie were freshmen at Danville High, Happy at 35 was liberated at last. He would never again wear a hairpiece of any kind. It was as if Charlie had had this sudden resolve to remove his dentures and, winding them up like a pair of novelty choppers, set them down on the plaid blanket and let them chatter their way past the potato salad, a carefree spirit at home in the world. He just couldn't imagine it. Nor could he shake the image of that flying toupee. The ticklish absurdity of such a thing taking flight and its proven ability to make people laugh whispered in his ear of monetary potential. Like the hula hoop before it, the slinky, the frisbee, the pet rock, and the pogo stick, he could see it selling from sea to shining sea. But it was first and foremost a testament to joy, an ode to the ridiculous that put beauty before the bottom line and fun before riches and fame. The original Doolander was his bid to satisfy an itch, as persistent in him as masturbation ever was, to be the man with the common touch, the cause of envy in other men, and the object of their love. He came up with the name before securing a patent, then borrowed $600 from Happy to hire an engineer. "I would like your God's honest opinion of the toy I have in mind," he wrote that man in their opening correspondence. If you think it's catchy and or feasible, or just a waste of time and money. The developer's reply was enthusiastic. He believed that the original Doolander, the world's first flying haircut, was interesting, probably ingenious, and almost certainly guaranteed to be a smash hit. With the prototype in hand, Charlie set out to entice financial backers. He organized meetings with bankers, made cold calls to financiers, wrote letters to Walt Disney and Spud Mellon. He took the prototype around to local toy stores, looking for an angle, an opening of any kind. He hired an illustrator to reconstruct in a light 70s sketch the scene of the Doolander's first launch, ultimately executed by way of a rack and pinion device, and other wholesome images promoting family fun in a Doolander fact sheet and brochure. Still, too many people failed to get it. Why a toupee? How does it work again? Is there really a need for this in the marketplace?
Fantastic. That's fantastic. And I don't think I'm giving anything away here, but the what seems, I mean, it's one of many, stories about him, and then that it comes back into the ending just as an image in the most beautiful way. So that fantastic. It's also something I was saying, I was, really relating to this book just in the dealing with my own father's death. My father was a linguistics professor and a poet, but someone with very similar, there was a point where he had everyone in my house trying to write fortunes for fortune cookies because he was going to start a fortune cookie business and somehow have literary fortunes, and that lasted for a week, and then I was relating.
Did money go into this? Did he sink money into this?
No, thank God.
Just your time.
Just something we were all going to do now.
I should say my dad is really isn't this guy, because he would never have such a zany idea as the Doolander. That had to be invented.
Right.
But he did, toward the end of his life, he had this thing called the Dad's Hall of Fame, which kind of combined the two things that he did really well, like a commercial enterprise, because you would go online and sign up and nominate your dad and get a page, and then you would buy the apparel and whatnot. So and he'd get a little taste of that. He'd get a little taste of each hat you bought on behalf of your dad or whatever, the fee. But it also combined this thing that meant a lot to him, being a dad, his dad, something with heart. And so that was much closer to that was my dad. I mean, he was just, he had to kind of pair these commercial endeavors with something that meant something to him.
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, it's you're writing about someone who is fundamentally different, but that appreciation definitely comes through. That this is a book. You're writing about someone who makes a lot of bad decisions, and there is a layer of resentment there, but it's ultimately very definitely a love story. Is that okay to say? I mean,
yes, that is very much okay to say. I think that's exactly it.
Yeah.
I mean, it had to be filtered. I had to get distance from my own story.
Yeah.
And I had to provide subtext so that the reader was digging, and things were being revealed in ways that, if it were just my story, I would just sort of go on rants, and I would do extended self-explanations and justifications and things that are not, they don't belong in a book. They might belong in conversation with, with drinks with friends, but they didn't belong in a book. So I had to invent a lot to make sure that there was subtext and revelation and things that would engage a reader. Now, what's so fascinating in this, I think you'll find it fascinating too, is that I actually got closer to how I psychologically feel in my family as a sort of an outsider and a marginalized figure by inventing than I would have if I had just written my story.
Yeah.
It works in very weird ways, and I can't figure it out. It's such a hall of mirrors, but it's as if the hall of the initial image has been plucked out, and you can't tell what's real and what's not, but the emotion comes through.
Yeah. I think also, the stories that we tell when we're trying to give straight autobiography, it's not that, like you said, it's not that they aren't fictionalized, right? And they're often such well-worn grooves, these
Yeah.
memories, or the way that we phrase it, or the way we think about it, that retreading that doesn't do a lot for us. At
Yeah.
some point, right? We're doing something new.
Yeah. Well, they're
Yeah,
a little fossilized, aren't they? So
right.
when you try to animate them, it's like trying to, make a petrified log, turn it back into a bush. It's not going to happen. A flowering bush. It ain't going to happen.
I like it. I like that. We're getting really good questions from the audience. I have more for you too, but I'm gonna turn to some of these. So Beth is asking, and I'm going to add to this. Beth is asking why you ultimately pivoted away from naming the main character Joshua, and touched on that a bit. And if I can add to that, like, why Jake Barnes? I mean, it's certainly a iconic protagonist from American literature.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to think of as someone who's definitely he's wounded, right? He's sort of a wanderer in many ways, but can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I'll answer this one and then we'll go back to Beth's question.
Mhm.
There's a moment in the book where you realize that this guy actually is quite wounded. The
Mhm.
narrator's very wounded. So he doesn't have the problem that Jake Barnes has, but he has of something very similar. And so and they without giving too much away, he's damaged. And so I thought of that for that reason. I also remember very clearly that being the first book that I read when I moved in with my father when I was 12 or 13.
Mhm.
And being blown away, but also my father didn't really understand literature or fiction or novels or poetry. He just wasn't a literary man. So he thought I would be really bored by Hemingway. Like Hemingway would bore me because it had bored him.
Yeah.
And so I just thought that was like an extracurricular reason to put him in. But he had also these, and this probably answers Beth's question. At some point in some dark moment, and this was during the Trump years, so keep in mind that this was a very big scrim under which I think a lot of people were working or operating. The whole thing, a man's life, cultural life, a human being's life, certainly the political life, just seemed to be all fiction. It just seemed to be there. There were facts that you could, if you were with sane people, that you could agree on, but they were becoming fewer and farther between. And the amount of invention going on at the national level matched the amount of invention that goes on at the familial level. That also seemed to match the amount of illusion and delusion that seems to enter into any one individual's life. And I came to conclude, as I say, in a dark moment, that there was no discerning between the two. And so I really wanted to lace the book with a fictionality, with elements of fictionality constantly and throughout, to relay at all points that there really was no stable ground here. That at any moment in time, not only is this book going to shift, but real life shifts. When you get a divorce, for instance, you think that was the bad time, I'm off to the future. But that's to rewrite, that's to revise. And so fiction, the writing of fiction, the living for fictions just became, in my mind, what we all do, even if we don't write fiction. And well, it just so happened that I was a writer of fiction, could write fiction about it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We have I think I'm going to ask this one next, because talking about kind of the broader cultural scrim, as you put it, under which we're all writing. Amy is asking, actually, both of us as fiction writers, are we planning, or how do we find ourselves navigating placing the current pandemic into future work? I think the broader question there that you were starting to get to, a second ago, is that we're writing in very unusual times. I mean, everyone's always living in unusual times, so I don't know when on earth, anyone was writing with any stability. But this it seems like this is the book that you wrote during the Trump years.
Yeah.
Do you even know what you're working on next? Or are you still?
I know, but I haven't started really.
Yeah.
I think I would have said that, well, this is just a blip, that the pandemic is a blip. It's turning into a very long blip, and that blip might in fact be turning more into a blob. And then we're going to really have to contend with the blob when we write fiction.
Yeah.
But, I think like anything, it will be historicized at some point. The coronavirus won't be as deadly or as headliney as it is now, and its mitigation will be something that we contextualize. I mean, not many people thought even 6 months after 9/11 that we would ever write again. We would never write fiction again. Fiction became incredibly insignificant in the days and weeks after 9/11 because it was rebuked, and everything was rebuked. Every slight, every joke, every way of life was rebuked. I mean, we had editorials out there about the death of irony.
Yeah.
It didn't feel like anybody could write fiction again during that time, but we did, and we incorporated it. And I suspect that this will just be contextualized in a certain way. And I think what is more compelling, and maybe what this writer is asking about, is what will you do? How can you incorporate it in interesting fictional ways? How can you subvert it? How can you promote it? How can you use it to make an interesting story? I mean, I thought about just randomly, a wonderful love story could be made of two people meeting in a backyard, masked, that normally wouldn't do that because they're neighbors or something like that. And the whole movie or the whole book is just about their exchanges. They're falling in love without being able to touch or to consummate that relationship because of fear or hesitation or actual, COVID. I mean, these stories will get told, and they will be maybe even better for COVID's presence in them.
Yeah, I'm finishing a book right now. I'm like, waiting for my editor's edits kind of phase, and I have most of it set in 2018. But I wanted to have a now section that I was, originally going to be 2021. And I'm like, well, I'm going to put it in the spring of 2022 so I can avoid the COVID thing. And now I'm like, so do I have to go through this manuscript and slap masks on everybody's face? I mean, it can, ultimately be the same book, but I need, every time it said she smiled, I need to be like, she seemed to smile.
Right. She smiled with her eyes.
Right. Yeah.
I was able to do that at the the 11th hour. I threw in something about a pandemic in the end of my book. One of the nice things about that was, I just was able to really convey a lot of time, the passage of a lot of time very quickly. So that the book seemed to contain so much more than the 2008 recession when it begins. And I thought of that as a silver lining.
Yeah, I think that, as long as you can keep writing through whatever's going on, anything that's happened in the world has ended up only enriching my work, right?
Yeah.
It's only, even if it's hell out there, which it is, it's only ever made it feel more urgent that I write. It's only ever added things.
Well, you're responding right to the fact of the shit of the world, and that's what compels you to be a writer. And so to some extent, it's the utopian, the optimist, the person who is convinced of progress that doesn't actually know how to deal with that. And it really kind of spoils the work because you can feel either propaganda or wishful thinking or something that is false entering in and manipulating the world into something a little bit more cheery. And that I don't usually buy.
Yeah. Well, there's this, the title of the book and a big theme of the book is the idea of a calling, of dharma, of, like this, what is the thing you're meant to do? And there's this discussion of, for Jake, the writer, it's like, well, it's obvious you were meant to write. And he has a different skew on it. But that drive, it's something that I've often taken for granted, I think, as a writer, just the I don't know, when you knew that you were a writer, but for me, it was middle school. And just like that question that Charlie is grappling with in this book of, what is he meant to do? What will work? What having kind of infinite choice.
Yeah.
Something I think so, whether you're finding success or not, something about being an artist that's like, well, this is the thing that is a relief and a release valve, I guess.
Yeah, it's a blessing and a curse, I suppose, is the phrase, really, because you've had to do a lot of work. You've had to really devote your life to something. You've had to ignore your children at times. I know they don't know that, but probably every once in a while, you've had to tell them to go away while you were finishing a chapter. You have all these opportunity costs as a writer. I certainly do. And I think that people that don't have that kind of calling might have more fun, but they might also worry about the fact secretly, maybe not openly, but secretly worry about floundering, having no purpose, having no direction. Certainly that was the character that I created. He did not really know what he should do with his life. And that is what bothers him profoundly toward the end of his life, when cancer is calling and time is short and it's over. And he's got to find it before he dies. And if he finds it before he dies, then he's lived correctly. But he continues to make a mistake. He doesn't exactly know what that is. What is a correct decision for him, until he lands on it almost by accident and changes his life. And I think that was, I keep trying to distance my old man from this guy, and it's true. But the one remarkable fact of my dad was how much he changed in the 7 years that he was granted, from the time of his diagnosis until he eventually died. And just to follow up actually on the story I initially told, when he called me those 7 years later, in an echo of that first call, he said, I have some good news and I have bad news. And I can't remember what the good news was, but I said, give me the good news. And my UTI is cleared up, or my whatever. Right. And the bad news, the cancer is back. It's in my lungs, my liver, and my spine, or something like that. And I have about 3 months to live. And he was at ease. He was at peace. And it was remarkable. He had done so much work in life. He had done so much reflection. Now, I also have to say that it was, a physical torment by that point in time. Life was a physical torment. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't walk. He was struggling. And the body had taught him how to die in ways that when he got the diagnosis at 68, when he felt pretty good, except for maybe some bowel changes,
right,
he wasn't ready to say, I'm ready to die. But then he was, and there wasn't any tears and there wasn't any thrashing. And he just simply said, sort of, with sorrow, I don't want to leave you guys, but I'm ready to go. And it was really, it was the most remarkable conversation I had with him. And I had many remarkable conversations with him.
That is absolutely amazing. God, wow. I feel like it would be too hard a pivot right now to a couple questions in the chat box that are like, I think we can do it anyway, because I think this is a book that pivots in many ways. But we have a question about humor, and you just said something that was like profoundly moving, and I feel odd asking you this now. But
no, do it. No, we moved on from the sad. Let's move on from the sad.
Yeah. So we have a question from Marcella, which is that kind of going back to my point that humor and play have always been strong in your fiction. What's your writerly recommendation to successfully incorporate humor into fiction? Like, do you think about being funny, or does it just come out that way?
I think that you have to surprise yourself a little bit. The social constraints are intense when we're out in the world. I certainly feel them very, very strongly. I don't tend to be the funny guy at the dinner table. Because I'm a little bit more more well behaved maybe. And then you see somebody who's not a writer, who doesn't give a damn, and they're just throwing out the lines that might offend, but are very funny. And you have to get to that point. You have to trust both yourself, I think, and your audience to know that you're leaving social constraints behind, because it's in transgression, it's in statements that appall or leave the listener aghast, that humor starts to get generated. And if you trust yourself and you allow yourself that sort of like safe space of writing, and you really let it go, work those constraints away, then humor will emerge, because it's, you're going to tap into your subconscious, and that's where some of the funny resides, either because it's transgressive or gross or just offensive even. You can't be afraid to offend a little bit.
That's really interesting, because I think that some of your humor definitely is sort of that transgressive, someone saying what they shouldn't say. I don't know that, I think maybe just what I find funny is different, but I think some of it is just like, what you're saying is absolutely true. I also think that there are skills of pace, like sentence pacing and things like that you have down, that, rhythm and things like that are, they're less about transgression and just more about timing.
Yeah, that's probably all just revision. That's just revision. That's just honing and honing and honing until it's so very not funny to me.
Yes.
You got to work it, you got to work it like, you hear these stories of the stand-up comedians who run through the material over and over and over again. And they've got that pacing down, they've got that timing down, but that is not new to them. They have worked that until it's to the bone. And so really you have to kill any humorous instinct through revision, and then you'll be really funny.
Yeah. I noticed that I'm funniest in my writing when I'm trying to be very serious, and almost like I can't keep a straight face on stage, where I'm like, this is kind of ridiculous. And that's and on the contrary, when I'm trying to be, not trying to be funny, but I'm trying to be like light, I end up just, getting out the daggers in the middle and just bringing you down. You
would be good at a dinner party.
It's whenever those are back on the in the world. I just bum everyone out, and then when everyone's bummed out, I'll try to make them laugh, and everyone just deals with me by drinking too much, and then everyone has a really good time. We have a question from Jack about how writing this novel was different from writing your other novels. I'm curious about that. Not only, I think you've talked a great deal about, process in this one, where it came from. Seems like it came from a very different place than your previous novels. I'm also curious just about like placing your career. You write your first book not knowing that anyone's ever going to read it, but you're hopeful, and maybe your classmates. And your career has stayed prominent. You're writing this one knowing that it's writing something deeply personal, but knowing there's going to be a broader audience for it. So I'm curious about that too. Like, did this feel different in a lot of ways?
It felt very different because it was autobiographical. I did enough to mitigate that and to play with it, but it's there's a lot of fact there, and I actually didn't know. I'd never really done that before. And then we came to the end, was about advertising and the people that I knew in advertising. But the weird thing about that is, when setting a story in an office setting, if you have a stapler and whatever, you've got you can do whatever you want, because people know that it's very familiar. You can have people dying on the floor, or writhing, and you can have the most absurd situations, and you can import them all in, and people believe it because you're in an office setting. Here, I really had to this is probably the difference to answer the question. It's really intricately plotted. It might not feel that way because it's so sort of loose, but it was almost as if I just had this outline set in stone, and I had to hit the spots. And for a long time, I had the ratios off, and I had to revise, I had to condense, or then, whatever, but I had to get the ratios right.
Yeah.
And so it's really very heavily plotted.
It's interesting. The only reason that I'm going, yeah, is like it's that thing of like a magician watches a magic show and they're like, oh, I think I see what you're doing there. I don't think that I would, were I not a writer, I don't think I would have felt that way. But the turns of fate, particularly,
Right.
there's a sort of an
Right.
Aristotelian thing going on with,
Right.
get really
Right.
nerdy here, but there's some,
That's exactly right. Yeah.
yeah.
It just had to be that way. And ordinarily I wouldn't have done it that way. I probably did it that way in part because, well, this book had to do that, but it also just, I was like sick of just random writing, that grief
Yeah.
writing that I was talking about. I was like, I gotta write a book here. I can't just keep doing this.
Yeah. Well, so okay, one thing, this is my question, is I think we'll do a couple last things here, but okay, like I said, I'm in the Chicago suburbs here. So is the Chicagoland connection, is that from real life? Or did you just borrow a geography?
No, my dad lived in Schaumburg.
You
I
did
went
live in
to
Chicago.
I went to high
Okay.
school in Downers Grove.
Yeah.
And then finally he made it to Park Ridge at the end of his life, and I still have a lot of friends there. And no, that's I mean, if I'm going home, I'm going to Chicago suburbs. Weirdly, I'm going to Chicago.
That's incredible. So I have to ask if you know about one of my favorite Onion articles of all time, which it's so hyper local, but it was early days of the Onion, and it was like Schaumburg man vaguely aware of non-Schaumburg world out there. Have you seen this? I'm emailing it to you after this. It's it's one of those ones. I hope it still exists online because it was in the paper physical Onion, and it was like this guy who had just never. If people who don't know, it's like a town. I'm sure there's more to it, but if your impression of this place could very much be like, oh, it's an IKEA and a cheesecake factory and a Gap outlet and
I mean, you're right. It has a really great forest preserve in the middle of it.
Cool.
And that is so wild because suddenly you're like, you turn away from the cheesecake factory and you're like seeing cranes and turtles, and it's so shocking.
Oh,
but yeah, it's, other than that, it is really the worst of the worst.
Yeah.
With all due respect.
Listen, next time you're in Schaumburg, we're going to meet up and have meatballs at the IKEA in the middle.
While sitting on a bench in the forest preserve.
Yeah, get the IKEA meatballs and we'll go to the forest preserve and that'll be we'll catch up. So I'm going to end with a question from the chat that I didn't get to yet, which was someone asking, both of us actually, this is Jess asking, what has been a favorite book you've read during the pandemic? Which I guess would just like, what have you read in the past 2 years that you really like, is another way of putting that.
I would say that my great discovery of late has been Miriam Taves.
Oh.
Who is just so fantastic, like All My Puny Sorrows, and she has a new one called Fight Night. Is that what it's called? And she's just so good. I just love her. That would be mine.
That's so cool. I have to be very careful with the way I answer that because I judged I don't know why I did this to myself 2 years in a row. I judged the National Book Award last year and I'm judging the Penn Faulkner this year. So wow. I can't be like, my favorite book of the year so far is.
It's difficult.
Yeah, I'm not really allowed to say that stuff, but I can say I definitely got into some memoirs recently that I really loved that I can talk about. There's Eleanor Henderson, who wrote 10,000 Saints was her debut novel. That was I think 2011 or so. She has a memoir out right now that's about an incredibly complicated marriage. And it's, like with any writer, you're really in it more for the way it's told than the content, but it's also just fascinating content. And it's called Everything I Have Is Yours.
He's sick, is that right?
Yeah.
The husband is ill.
Yeah. And a lot of other stuff too. So it's sort of been my guilty pleasure. Like anything that is not American fiction that was published this year is now my guilty pleasure because Like
You've really put yourself through the ringer here. 2 years of that.
I know it's a long story, but it just both, yeah. It's also it's been lovely.
I bet.
The pen folder is much less strict. The National Book Award is a little strict about like try not to do events, try not to blurb, try not to review. And with the Penn Faulkner, it's much, there's much more leeway. So it's been like, I'm able, it's like, okay, anytime that I can, like, I'm going to read all these books anyway, kill two birds with one stone, something I want to read, let's do an event, But then, yeah, I can't be like, here are my top 10 books of the year in order. That would not be a good look, I think, at the moment. But yeah, anything that is not contemporary American fiction is like this wild rebellion on my part to like read something from 2 years ago or to read something French or whatever. It's like, it's great to feel like a rebel by just doing your homework in a chair. Anyway, so we want to give a huge thanks here to Midtown Scholar. Amazon does not bring you events like this, and they don't care about where you buy your books, but this is a really, really amazing place to buy a really amazing book. And you should be doing that right now. Or buy some Miriam Taves or Eleanor Henderson or whatever. I'm sure they have those too.
Or some Rebecca Makkai.
That too.
I did it on purpose.
Oh, you did it on purpose. Thank you. I wasn't going to correct him. We were talking before we went on about how people mispronounce my name. So he just to annoy me. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, listen, speaking of appreciation, thank you so much for doing this, for jumping in and having a great conversation. This was just terrific.
Absolutely. This is delightful. And like a better way to spend a Thursday night than folding laundry, which was the other choice. So
thank you.
Just wanted to jump in here and say thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Rebecca. Joshua, congrats again.
Thanks, man.
A Calling for Charlie Barnes. Here it is. Signed copies, Midtown Scholar bookstore. Midtownscholar.com is our website, or you can hop into our store Wednesday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. You can get The Great Believers. You can get A Calling for Charlie Barnes. In fact, we just got signed copies of Fight Night, Joshua, just in stock today. So we'll be having that as well. So once again, thank you to our audience members for your question. Thanks again to Rebecca and Joshua, and everyone have a good night.
Thank you both.
Bye.
Bye.